I'd like to welcome everyone to this launch of the new ASPI book, The Geopolitics of Climate and Security in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Robert Glasser. I am the head of the ASPI Climate and Security Policy Center and one of the co-authors of the book. Before commencing the proceedings, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Ngunnawal people, and would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. Usually with events like this, with a book project of this sort, there are a lot of people to acknowledge, and I can't acknowledge everyone, but I would like to make a few quick acknowledgements. I will be acknowledging KAS, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and Bertil, who's here, who will be making his own welcoming remarks in a moment. But I particularly want to acknowledge the co-editors. I'm one of the editors of the book, the co-editors of the book, Kathy Johnston, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us, but she may be joining us online. Anastasia Kapetas, who's you'll be hearing from shortly. Also Steve Clark, who's our ASPI Publications Manager, who's also played a key role in this. I want to also acknowledge Will Lieben. Will, who's sitting over here, for those of you at home can't see, was really instrumental in helping us pull together the whole project, and I'm extremely grateful to him for his the commitment and energy he's put into this project. Of course, the chapter authors, three of whom you'll be meeting a bit later today, so I won't introduce them. But also my colleagues, Matthew Page. I think Bridie is here somewhere. Bridie is one of our authors. Thanks for coming, Bridie. And if there are clearly others joining online, so welcome and thank you, authors. In ASPI, I also want to acknowledge both Michael Shoebridge, who helped commenting on the drafts, and Peter Jennings, the head of ASPI, for their support, both on the book project, but also on the establishment of the center focusing on climate and security here at ASPI. I also, just on a personal note, want to acknowledge my wife, Kirsten Anker, who is a wonderful reality checker and not at all embarrassed to tell me when I've written something silly. So yeah, thanks for all of your support, Kirsten, as usual. Okay, the running order. Following my welcome remarks, Bertil, whom I'll introduce in a moment, will make some remarks. Then we have some special keynote remarks by the Chief of the Defense Forces. And following General Angus Campbell's presentation, I'll make a few observations, share with you a few observations about this project. And then we'll move to a panel discussion which will be moderated by Anastasia. I just want to invite, I know many of you are joining online. I just wanted to invite you to be sure to submit questions throughout the discussion. Anytime you see something that raises a question in your mind that's relevant, please use the discussion tab in the right-hand side of the screen, and also be sure to upvote any questions you would like to be discussed. Without any further ado, and of course to thank you all, both here in person and those joining, and on the occasion of this dreadful, what appears to be quite a large invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, and before introducing my colleague Bertil, I just want to, on my own behalf, and I know many in this room as well, hopefully all in this room, extend our best wishes to the people of the Ukraine in this extremely dark moment for them and difficult time. So without any further ado, let me invite Bertil Wenger, who is the director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Regional Program for Australia and the Pacific. KAS funds and participates and sponsors enormously useful work around the world, not just here in Australia, to improve public policy and through that improve or make a contribution anyway to improving the state of the world. Bertil, thank you so much for the support KAS has provided to this project. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for this warm introduction. As said, I, together with my colleague Eva Wagner, she's also here today. We represent Konrad Adenauer Foundation. She's over here. And we're very pleased to be here. And let me just also take this opportunity on the occasion of this dreadful morning that Europe just is waking up to, what appears to be a massive airstrike and also land invasion of Ukraine. We are, as Konrad Adenauer Foundation, promoting democracy, peace, understanding, and the rule of law in the world with more than 100 offices. And I'm very happy to say that I'm among friends with you here in Australia, with like-minded people. We are in a group of strong nations around the world who are putting forward the rule of law and an international rules-based order. And I'm thankful to be here. And we will prevail in this struggle of the systems that we are seeing with Russia and others. Well, ladies and gentlemen, turning to tonight's topic, it is my pleasure to, as Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to be on board and contribute to the publishing of this important book. The beginning of this decade is marked by the impact of extreme resource overuse. And the COVID-19 pandemic caused by a zoonosis and also the rapidly advancing climate crisis is forcing governments around the world to take far-reaching and complex crisis management actions. And despite the significant and scientific knowledge about these growing non-traditional security risks, prevention is not yet sufficient to protect populations and the economies around the world. And so therefore it's high time to deal with the implications of climate change on security policy. In recent years, it has become evident how great the negative consequences of climate change in fragile regions are already. Even with a temperature rise of only 1.2% Celsius, extreme events and slow creeping changes threaten the basis of life already today, particularly in regions where people live in poverty or where they are politically and socially marginalized. Resource scarcity can exacerbate these intercommunal tensions further and allow existing conflicts to escalate. We therefore need to identify principles and fields of action for dealing with armed conflicts that may arise and clearly point out to the challenges of climate change for foreign and security policy. It is clear that the preventive and civil means must have priority in containing these crises. Peace, security, and development depend highly on a stable world climate. But especially in the field of foreign and security policy, strategies and concrete measures on just how to cope with growing climate risks have so far been lacking or remain underdeveloped. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown in the last 2 years that resource overexploitation, which seem far distant, can have significant negative consequences for the entire world. At the same time, early intervention in the course of the crisis and the interaction of determined politicians and individual action as key instruments have shown to be able to contain the crisis and the damage inflicted. Despite the overwhelming evidence on the existence-threatening effects of climate change, however, no protective measures that could be seen as similarly ambitious and appropriate to the urgency have been taken as in the case of the COVID pandemic. The rapid succession of causes and consequences of the COVID pandemic in terms of time and space increased the pressure to act further. The perception of the crisis and its risks, as well as personal acute concerns, are decisive factors in ensuring that measures to prevent the infection were implemented much faster than measures were taken reducing or adapting to the climate change. Because the risk from climate change have already increased, future crises will have to be dealt with against the background of deteriorating environmental conditions, such as the increase of extreme weather events. It's therefore important to learn from the lessons we learned from the COVID crisis in tackling the climate crisis. Next to the primacy of prevention, the relevance of international cooperation has to be named in the context of climate-related security risks. It is only by international cooperation that we will succeed in solving these global crises. The book presented today, a publication of which we are, as KAS, very proud to have supported, shows the complex relationships between climate impacts, conflicts, and human security, and provides for an excellent overview of the multifold related aspects influencing our lives. Based on this analysis of the book, existing gaps were identified and recommendations for action formulated for the Australian federal government. I look forward to today's exchange of experts and the findings of our panel debate that we will see following in due course. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Bertil, for those comments. So the Chief of the Defense Forces, General Angus Campbell, was going to be here, but he's unfortunately traveling. However, given what's happened in the Ukraine, I think he's probably not traveling where he thought he would be traveling. So, but he's very kindly recorded a message for us on the occasion of the launch. So it gives me great pleasure at this point to introduce some keynote remarks from General Angus Campbell, AODSC, Chief of the Australian Defence Forces.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Congratulations.
And congratulations
on the launch of the Australian Strategic Policy
landmark
publication,
publication,
The Geopolitics of Climate and Security in the Indo-Pacific. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, present and emerging. Like all of us, our Indigenous peoples, are deeply invested in the future of this great continent and the planetary systems that support its continuing sustainability. I also want to acknowledge the outstanding and ongoing work of the Climate Change and Security Policy Centre at ASPI, led by Dr. Robert Glasser. The Centre performs an essential role in driving forward discussion of the long-term strategic consequences of climate risk within our region. Those of us in defence are acutely aware of the significant impact climate risks will have on the future of our region. Both the 2016 Defence White Paper and the 2020 Defence Strategic Update identify that climate risk will affect our operating environment. The 2020 Strategic Update states that threats to human security, such as pandemics and growing water and food scarcity, are likely to result in greater political instability and friction within and between countries and reshape our security environment, including in the Indo-Pacific. These threats will be compounded by population growth, urbanisation, and extreme weather events in which climate change plays a part. The 2020 Strategic Update goes on to state that while defence has made substantial progress in building a more potent, capable and agile Australian Defence Force, adjustments to the 2016 Defence White Paper plans are required, including measures to enhance ADF support to civil authorities in response to national crises and natural disasters such as pandemics, bushfires, floods or cyclones. Defence has a key role in supporting the Australian Government's climate and disaster resilience agenda, integrating climate risk into the planning and conduct of ADF activities and operations. The Defence Strategic Update also noted that disaster response and resilience measures demand a higher priority in defence planning. Today, in Operation Tonga Assist 2022, the Australian Defence Force is working hard in just such a response. Many of these climate risks are most consequential and urgent in the Pacific region, and our support to the region is guided by the Framework for Pacific Regionalism and the Boy Declaration, with its values and vision of peace, harmony, security, social inclusion and prosperity, so that all Pacific people can lead free, healthy and productive lives. It states that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. It recognises an increasingly complex regional security environment driven by multifaceted security challenges and affirms their stewardship of the Blue Pacific and to strengthen and enhance capacity to pursue collective security interests in the region. Defence stands ready to support the Pacific in these aspirations. Australia remains a principal regional partner in supporting nations to respond to disasters, especially in the Southwest Pacific. Similarly, as a recent Centre for Strategic and International Studies report identified, Southeast Asia will be one of the world's most vulnerable regions to climate change, where a global warming increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius will cause rising seas, dangerous flooding, and changing rain patterns leading to violent typhoons and drought. These climate risks pose a threat to food security, hobbles economic growth, prompts political instability, and catalyses pandemics. As the contributors to this ASPI publication make clear, the impacts of climate risks on the geopolitics and security of the Indo-Pacific are complex but undeniable. They alter the context in which regional actors make decisions and influence the strategies they pursue to achieve their goals. These factors contribute to state fragility and the risk of strategic miscalculation. Defence considers climate and disaster resilience risk in its strategic guidance and planning, force structure preparedness and mobilisation, supply chain logistics, estate and infrastructure plans, joint force operations, technological innovations and capability development. The challenges are significant, as the work of ASPI's Climate Change and Security Policy Centre has highlighted. Sometimes it takes determination not to be disheartened by the scope and scale of the challenges our region faces, particularly when it comes to climate risks, especially as we manage other overlapping short-term risks and crises on a daily basis. But I am hopeful. Each challenge presents an opportunity for cooperation for the common good, helping us to overcome entrenched suspicions or rivalries through collective action. It may be in small ways at first, but enough small moments of cooperation can build into greater things. They form the foundation for a better future and a stronger community within the Indo-Pacific. I'm not disheartened by the challenges or the work ahead. I hope you're not either. The Climate Change and Security Policy Centre has done an excellent job in outlining the challenges we face within the region. But they've also pointed the way forward and offered potential solutions or areas for cooperation to address these challenges. It represents yet another step forward. Congratulations on the publication of The Geopolitics of Climate and Security in the Indo-Pacific. It should be closely read, and I hope it will inspire many to take heart and to take action. Thank you.
Our sincere thanks to General Campbell for those remarks in support of the launch of this book. Really interesting comments he's made. Now, before moving on to the panel discussion, I'd like to make a few comments to put the book project into perspective and also to help put the discussion that you'll hear on the panel into perspective. Our motivation in producing this book was to shed light on three critical factors that we felt were being overlooked in the climate change debate. Those three factors are, first, how rapidly severe climate impacts will begin appearing. They're actually, the science suggests, will now begin appearing non-linearly, when it's human nature to assume that the pace of the change and impacts we've seen over the last 10 years is going to be what we can expect over the coming 10 years. That's not correct. Second, it's the underestimate of the systemic nature of the impacts. Climate change is not an environment crisis. It's not a crisis of natural disasters. It is a global systemic crisis with disruptions that will transform the geopolitical landscape. And we wanted to point that out in this book. And third, we wanted to highlight the overlooked, particularly extreme exposure and vulnerability of the Indo-Pacific region. And I'd highlight the maritime Southeast Asia as another extraordinarily exposed and vulnerable part of our region. So to try and address these three issues, we took the following approach. First, we worked with some climate scientists to develop a scenario for 2035, the future, which illustrates both the systemic impacts, where we tried to draw those out, and also the scale of the hazards that have emerged in the year 2035 to illustrate those things. Second, we invited experts from a broad range of disciplines, ranging from great power competition to militaries, food insecurity, trade, sovereign risk, energy security, digital disinformation, and so on, to use the scenario as the common reference point for each of the chapters they're writing. What we've observed in the book that is before you and that I hope you'll have a chance to read is that taking this approach highlights the systemic impacts and connections that are otherwise invisible between various sectors, how one can affect the other and actually magnify the risk. In fact, the magnitude of the impacts, when you look at the holistic effect systemically, the magnitude of the impacts become far greater than the sum of the individual parts. Hence, we are underestimating the impacts of climate change. There are a few recommendations and observations that I just want to run through very quickly. There's the urgent need that the book highlights. First of all, an urgent need for a regional climate and security risk assessment that captures the systemic dynamics, that isn't done in a silo, either a domestic silo or an international silo, but the connections between the two, not organized by environment ministries, which generally tends to organize policy documents on climate. That's a symptom of the fact that things are not being seen as a systemic challenge, but as a whole of government process. Secondly, the book highlights that the energy, and I'm sure Maria this will come up in the panel session, that the energy transformation from fossil fuels to renewables is itself an enormous geopolitical change, and it in itself will upend geopolitics and geostrategic issues that we've been comfortable with for decades and decades, with winners and losers, and the enormous need to help countries make this transition in the interests of not just regional prosperity, but regional security and stability, this energy transition. Thirdly, the food and water impacts that emerge as a source of disruption in the chain of events that leads to political instability, people movements, conflict. That a key issue is understanding the connections between water, food, and disruptions that follow from that and cascade through society, and the global connections as well, because food, as you know, is a global system as well that has major impacts. And then the final recommendation or observation I'd just highlight is the particularly fundamental role of China. First of all, it's geopolitically important in and of itself. Secondly, it's playing a fundamental role in the key energy transformation, including the provision of technology to regional neighbors. So thirdly, climate change will have enormous impacts domestically on China. And fourthly, because China already is a prominent player in a number of regional hotspots, whether it's the South China Sea or the Mekong River Basin. So understanding the impacts climate change will have on China in these multiple dimensions is an urgent priority, including identifying opportunities to cooperate with China to address the risks that are emerging. So this is just a quick snapshot. We're going to move to the panel now. We clearly in this panel discussion can't capture all of those multiple systemic dimensions of this, but we're going to highlight a few for you. And then I hope it will whet your appetite to have a closer look at the book that's been produced. So now I'd like to invite my colleague Anastasia Kapetas to the stage to open the panel and introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. So we'll just get straight into our panel discussion. So first I'd like to introduce our panelists. Maria, starting with you, Maria Pastukhova, who contributed the chapter on the geopolitics of energy transition. Maria is joining us from Berlin this evening. She's a senior policy advisor at E3G, an independent European climate change think tank. She leads E3G's work on energy diplomacy, international energy finance, and the geopolitics of energy systems transition. Our second panel member tonight is David Michel, who's joining us from Stockholm. He is a senior researcher with the Environment of Peace program at the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, and has written extensively on water security and geopolitics, including, of course, a chapter on water security for this book. And finally, I'd like to introduce ASPI's John Coyne. John is the head of the Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement program here at ASPI, and has contributed the chapter on the interaction between climate change and transnational organised crime in the region. So a very welcome to you all tonight, and thank you for making time to be with us, especially on what has turned out to be a very sombre evening for all of us. Each of our panellists will give a brief opening remarks for 3 minutes each, and because we're on a really tight time schedule, I hope you don't mind, panellists, if I just wind you up when we need to move on. Thank you. We'll then have a very brief panel discussion where we'll try and again explore some of these connections between climate and water and security and energy, as well as some of the social impacts like organised criminal activity. And after that, we'll open the discussion to questions from the floor for roughly 15 minutes. And for those, again, joining us on Zoom, please, again, type your questions on the side panel and upvote the questions you like the most, and we'll try and get to you as well. So Maria, if we could start with you, given our 1.5 degree scenario, what are the main things that we need to be thinking about in terms of security, and climate and energy transition?
Thank you very much, and good morning from Berlin, everyone. Delighted to be part of today's conversation. So when we look at the energy systems in the Indo-Pacific, when I try to draw a picture of Indo-Pacific by 2035, focusing on the development of energy systems in the region and geopolitics around them, then what we see is a rather expected outcome, which is the status quo is not an option in the regional development planning of energy systems. The extreme weather events, unchecked loss and damage, and increased vulnerability of energy systems to the impacts of climate change no longer leave any room for business as usual assumptions for the countries. When we go and on and project the trends that we observe now in the energy systems development, be it growing pace for renewables deployment, electrification of crucial economy sectors across countries, or gradually closing gap on energy access, or even new commitments in emerging policies to address climate change and decarbonize economies. So when we project these trends to an ideal theoretical 2035, we have not a perfect but fairly reassuring picture. The International Energy Agency projected in its latest World Energy Outlook that if current emission reductions pledges are implemented and decarbonization policies are in place, we'll end at 2.1 warmer climate by mid-century, which is not ideal, but not as drastic as some have been projecting. But when we add the inevitable reality of mounting climate risks to this, then the picture changes dramatically, showing that not only the current pledges are not enough to hold the speed of the climate change, but also that these pledges are much more difficult to implement with every year of inaction, as climate impacts have a disruptive effect on economies and political regimes, undermining their ability to act and adapt in the most dramatic way. Lack of resilience of the energy sector to climate change is here a major weak spot in every country's future planning, as energy systems are the backbone of every modern economy, inevitably linked to human health, food systems, industrial growth, but also the ability to act as an autonomous player internationally. Another takeaway from the scenario that has been drawn in my chapter is that energy systems in the Indo-Pacific will not be affected evenly. We see that island states and countries with larger coastlines are much more exposed. The energy infrastructure is much more exposed to extreme weather events. The countries with urban centers closer to the coastal line will need to act preventively much quicker. And also countries that are now deprived of sufficient finance to speed up their transition, to speed up the transition of their economies to a decarbonized ones, to speed up the transition of energy systems to ones more resilient to climate change, will be affected much more, as their ability to act on this and to boost their resilience shrinks with every year as the climate impacts really increase. What we also see is that the emerging geopolitical trends in the region are being cemented by accelerated climate impacts. And China's position there is, of course, a very important one. We see that Southeast Asia is transforming from a so-called maritime periphery for major regional powers such as China and India to a place of great power competition on energy standards, on finance, and also on political influence. And China, which has been historically dominant in the region and in the region's energy system planning through historic links, but also close links to region governments and energy companies, has managed to establish itself as a standard bearer in this increasingly decarbonized but also very messy energy sector. And we also see that China, having so many neighbors that are really vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, is much interested in a successful energy transition and climate resilience of its neighbors, because climate migration leads to tensions in its southern borders. We can expect it very with a high reassurance. Moreover, its major low-carbon technology production centers are increasingly exposed to climate impacts because most of them are located in Southeast Asia and threaten Chinese companies with supply disruptions and loss of capital. We also see an emergence of another major geopolitical actor in the region. India's presence has grown considerably in the scenario that I'm picturing, particularly within the interregional cooperation between India and ASEAN power grid connectivity initiatives. And it becomes, with its Make in India policy, the third largest manufacturing center for photovoltaic cells. So it also aims to lead with technology. We see all these developments, and we see also the emergent geopolitical battles in the region that don't necessarily contribute to a very resilient picture when you look at the energy systems. And
sorry, I might have to wind you up there. Is there a closing remark you'd wish to make?
Yes, the closing remark would be the picture. So when we try to extrapolate the trends that we have now to the future and add climate impacts to that, then we see that the future picture is a very messy one, and a lot of muddling through will be happening while countries are trying to stick to their policies. This will not be possible given the disruptive effect of climate impacts, and we will end at a rather messy geopolitically but also economically picture in the region by 2035. That's the bad news. The good news is that the measures that can help prevent this are already existing and should be implemented, and they range. It is, as Robert said in the beginning, a systemic approach is needed to be able to address this. Ranging from shift of finance flows to the most vulnerable countries, but also to the systemic approach to the development of national regional power supply systems, preventive policies, particularly addressing urban centers close to the coastal lines. So there is a whole list of instruments in the toolbox of countries to address this, but this needs to happen, and this needs to happen quickly. I will stop here, and sorry for taking too much time.
No, thank you so much, Maria. David, moving on to you. What does the regional water security picture look like in the 1.5 degree scenario?
Thanks so much. I'd like to begin by thanking the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for affording us the opportunity to participate in this launch and, of course, to contribute to the volume. And I'd also like to acknowledge this very serious and troubling moment in time about which I only learned through this conference. It was 7:30 in the morning in Stockholm when I joined. To answer your question, I think there are three quick points that I'd like to make. The first is just to call out the diversity of the water security situation across a region as vast as the Indo-Pacific, so stretching from southern Africa to the Northeast Pacific, that no matter how we measure water stress or water availability, whether it's by per capita volume annually renewable water resources, or whether it's by a metric of water withdrawals or water use to water availability, there are significant diversities and disparities across the region. Countries like Bangladesh, Bhutan, Brunei, they enjoy thousands of cubic meters of water per person every year, whereas countries in the Persian Gulf enjoy only 10, 20 or less per person, and are rapidly exploiting and drawing down their groundwater resources that are only replenished on geological timescales in order to meet their water needs. Similarly, on the front of water use to availability, a country like Myanmar, for example, is only withdrawing for agriculture, municipal water use, 3% of its available water resources. So there's an incredible diversity of supply, which also means that there's an incredible diversity of water resource challenges. And this would take me to the second point, which is that climate change, the impacts of climate change are already emerging, and they are laying the shifting ground on which water management decisions will need to be made and are being made. An example of this is that we're now seeing, and in Australia, among other countries, in the headlines in the newspapers, examples that droughts that would only ordinarily occur once a century, or floods that would only ordinarily occur once a century, are now occurring far more regularly and expected to occur more regularly and with increasing intensity. And this changes the background against which infrastructure must be built and managed, water supplies must be measured and governed. But again, countries across the region bring diverse capacities, human resources, technical resources, financial resources, governance resources. They bring diverse coping capacities and resilience capacities to respond to and answer these challenges. And herein lies an important point that although climate change is setting the scene and exerting increasing pressures on water resources and water resource management across the region, it's far from being the only problem in resource management and governance, and that patterns of resource use and demand, often inefficient and wasteful patterns of resource use, whether it be subsidies to water withdrawals or the absence of economic signals and incentives for the conservation and more effective use of water resources, governance challenges and inadequacies and institutional capacities and challenges are as much a part of the equation, if not more a part of the equation, than the natural phenomena of climate change impacts. And this implies that there are both quite complex difficulties and challenges, but also significant opportunities to answer these challenges, in that climate change is not the only factor, that much lies in our hands, in our governance strategies, in technological innovations and applications, in natural and green management responses. But yet, the final point, these challenges are quite complex and interconnected, and that is very well brought out in the volume. And water security challenges, water management challenges exemplify these interconnections and these challenges and their possible geopolitical ramifications or implications for conflict risk. Just to take one historical example, not even an imaginary scenario that brought out by the scenario in the volume. If we look back to the food crisis of 2007-2008, we saw droughts in Australia, as well as Ukraine, Russia, Canada, in producer countries, contributing to fears about continuity of supply, to which questions such as subsidies and policies encouraging the use of biofuels, which redirected agricultural crops into biofuel production, put pressures on global food supplies, driving a psychology of fear of price spikes, that countries need to buy grain supplies today because the price might be even higher tomorrow, generating a price spiral which rippled throughout the global economy and led to instability, demonstrations, riots in several countries, which were not the countries in which the droughts occurred. That the global nature of grain markets exacerbated and cascaded the challenges and pressures from one sector and one geography into others. And these are the types of challenges that we will increasingly see, I fear, emerging under the impacts of climate change, and which will tie into and are tying into those governance, institutional capacity, technical capacity, societal resilience challenges that I outlined earlier.
Thank you so much, David. John, the relationship between climate and organised crime has been less explored in debates, but what are the key issues here for you?
Look, I guess we always think of climate change as a lose-lose situation for everybody. But there is one group of non-state actors who will make a literal and figurative killing out of climate change. And we're already seeing that at the moment. And that's a group that is innovative, amorphous, and entrepreneurial, which is transnational serious and organised crime groups in this region. Now, as states, and especially our fragile states across the region, begin to experience the impacts of climate change, and we're starting to see the breakdown, and markets can no longer provide services, and government falls back on goods and services, we see a great exposure to transnational serious organised crime. For those who don't work in the area, you might just turn around and say, well, doesn't that just create this miserable environment of selling drugs and other things? But it is just the beginning, and we're seeing some of these signs already. And I promise today I'll keep my comments really quite short, so I'm only going to talk about two things here, really. First and foremost is what we are going to probably see is, and we're starting to see these signs already, which is that as goods and services become more accredited and certified, what we're going to see is a movement of transnational serious organised crime into non-traditional markets. You might say, well, what does that really mean? Well, we're seeing that already playing out globally now. 10 years ago, I went and spoke to Metpol, the Metropolitan Police, and what they turned around and they said, John, all the multi-generational old school criminal families are really getting out of the sale of drugs. They're going into the sale of tobacco because it's more profit and less problems. Fast forward, what we're seeing now across the globe, tens of thousands of people die every year from fake pharmaceuticals, specifically anti-malarials. What we're going to see is as this environmental impacts start to happen, we're going to see those markets taken over. Further along that line is that, and we've seen this with timber, as different commodities, including food protein, become more scarce and we get a greater focus on trying to control climate change, we'll accredit supply chain. So already organised crime groups, for instance, 3 years ago, over 240 Thai and Cambodian officials were killed on the border of Thailand and Cambodia over illicit timber. What I see in the future here in the 2035 2035 scenario is today, if you go to Japan, you want to buy yourself a steak, you look at the back of it, it shows you where the cow came from, how it was treated, etc. As our food supply chain becomes, and food protein supply chain becomes more like that, what we'll see is transnational organised crime groups with a couple of different business models. The first one undercutting the legitimate market, the other one feeding in fake products that will have a deadly impact. If that wasn't in itself bad enough, the events of the last couple of years, regionally and globally, in terms of transnational serious organised crime, show us the next level of problem. In the first 6 months of the COVID crisis in 2020, in Central and Southern America, what we saw is cartel and organised crime groups actually replacing and providing government services instead of the government. Secondly, since the coup in Myanmar, and even before then, the heroin trade, the production of synthetic drugs like crystal methamphetamine in Myanmar pays for the local economy and people to get going. It pays their day-to-day wages. And as people came back from COVID, they became more involved in the production of methamphetamine and the production and manufacturing of heroin and other opioids. My message here is this, is that as states begin to fail, these amorphous organisations, and we want to picture them in a 1970s Godfather type structure. They're far more amorphous, entrepreneurial and innovative than that. They will fill those voids and spaces, and if we do not prevent them now, they will be difficult to dislodge.
Thanks so much, John. And look, we have gone a tiny bit over time, so what I might do is open questions up to the floor and of course to folk joining us virtually tonight. So if while people are thinking of questions, I can ask a question of the panelists first up. We really want to try, we've been drawing out some of these connections between security, climate, and some of these human systems. What are some connections? I'll just ask you both, Maria and David, what are some of the connections between energy transition and water security that you see looming on the horizon?
David, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, let me answer that by giving an example. The water, energy, and food use are, of course, intimately interconnected in what the decision makers often refer to as the water, energy, food nexus, which essentially means that I think we can see that it takes energy, for example, to clean and pump water from supply, from source to demand. It takes water to generate energy in the form not only of hydropower, but also the cooling of thermal power plants, for example. And then, of course, it also takes water and energy to grow and cook food, but also, as I mentioned in my earlier example of the 2007-2008 food crisis, certain agricultural crops can be turned into fuel. So there's the nexus. An example of the interconnection is that because these resources and their management are interconnected, decisions about how to manage them also embody trade-offs and potentially contending policy considerations. And we see this in the field of hydropower, that hydropower is often proposed as a green or at least a renewable energy solution that can replace fossil fuel sources for electricity supply, but that hydropower also has can have geopolitical and political conflict implications, and we can see this in a case like Myanmar, where the vast majority of the hydropower potential and capacity in Myanmar is located in the peripheral states that are home to indigenous populations that have contested the central government in Myanmar since the country's independence. And so there are significant tensions between the central government and these regional armed organizations over control of the land and the water that would be needed to build hydropower projects. You build a hydropower project that creates a reservoir for storing water to run through the turbines. That reservoir displaces populations. The power that would be generated by many of the hydro power projects in Myanmar would be destined for export to, for example, China, financed by China in many cases, so that local populations don't feel that they are deriving the benefits from the power generation. So there you see a class over natural resources, but also over governance, and that is exclusion from decision making that is as important as exclusion from the physical resource of land and water to build and operate a hydropower plant.
Maria, how do you see those connections?
Yeah, well, David named a couple of relevant links, I think. I would say that the interconnection between energy transition and water is going both sides. On the one side, we see that energy transition or transition to decarbonized energy system can directly lead to cleaner water, cleaner freshwater resources, can indirectly lead to richer freshwater resources if the energy transition is actually contributing to halting the climate change and as a consequence, desalination of freshwater resources, the droughts and all this all this climate impacts. On the other side, water is an absolutely crucial element for the energy transition, as it not just per se an energy resource. It consists of hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen being one of the future fuels, future still very high risk technologies, but which is considered more and more important for decarbonizing the last percent of the economy in the region. Water is also needed for the maintenance and operation of many of the renewable installations, be it solar plants or hydropower, as David mentioned. But water is also a resource that is partly contested by the energy transition and the human welfare. We see it particularly in case of hydro dams in Mekong Delta, where unsustainable hydro dam planning can undermine the livelihoods of the communities and affect the biodiversity. And a sustainable hydro dam planning can on the contrary, increase the energy access and boost economic growth in the region. The geopolitical aspect of water and of water as an energy carrier is undeniable. We see it not just in the Mekong Delta, but also on the Chinese-Indian border, where China is planning a hydro dam on Lower Brahmaputra part of the river, which India is also contesting, or which India to which Indian river system is directly connected. And this really has to do not just with the new energy generation capacity or power generation capacity. It also has to do with the geopolitical influence in the region. So there is a very, very direct link, I'd say.
Thanks, Maria. Look, we might go to a question from our online audience. And this is from James Walsh. So this is to all panel members. What are some of the impacts of climate change? What will some of the impacts on climate change have on the survivability of democratic systems? Very big question. Who would like to have a go at that one?
I might start because I touched on this, which is, from my perspective, our most fragile states in the Indo-Pacific are at most risk from transnational serious organised crime groups' attacks on democracy. We're already seeing and have seen it played out in small places. And by that I mean Myanmar in terms of the Shan and Wa state. I think in time we're going to see that expand significantly. Across the Pacific, earlier this week I spoke to a course of senior women leaders from across the Pacific who are looking at, who work in the border type arrangements. And I raised it with them that I think there's some really significant concerns there about and which is in the short term, as we see increased salinity, increased or decreased access to fresh water, impacts on reefs and other issues. What we're going to see is that influx of organised crime that can quickly fill those needs and at the same time manipulate the system.
Thanks, John. David or Maria, would you like to have a go at that one?
It's a great question. I think the the challenges of responding to these complex pressures, they certainly put strains on our current conceptions of the way political systems, particularly democratic political systems, operate and should operate. And what I mean by that is that, in my view, and in the view of a number of other analysts, the complexity of these challenges requires a form of governance and decision making that is sometimes called adaptive governance, or even reflexive governance, which essentially means that governance systems, decision makers need to be constantly updating their policy formulation and implementation with new information about the climate challenge and its impacts, but also new information about how societies are implementing and reacting to policy changes. That the green energy transition, for example, is an example of the way that new policies are creating new incentives and new actors in the policy space, and those actors themselves will make decisions and adapt to those new incentives. So metaphorically, the governance situation is kind of like the tightrope walker who, in order to maintain equilibrium, is not constantly methodically advancing in uniform steps, but is constantly adjusting to maintain their balance and evolve. But that can be a difficult situation for democratic systems, particularly in current times when the change of the potential change of direction in policy, the reevaluation that says, first we were doing this policy type, but now we see or we believe that we need to change to another policy type. That can be stressful in these times where expert knowledge is often questioned, scientific knowledge is questioned, that the revision of policies, think of COVID, should we wear masks, should we not wear masks, do vaccines work, do they not work, where that environment places enormous strain on our governance systems.
Maria, do you have a comment?
A very quick one. Yeah, it's actually to the question whether diplomacies are going to be affected. They're definitely going to be challenged by what's coming. And as we have seen in the energy systems space, you don't need a democracy to make energy transition work. China is probably one of the most successful countries in terms of boosting or expanding the renewables, power generation base, developing new low carbon technologies, which it has first borrowed from the OECD countries and then developed its own production and value creation chains. So democracy is not a prerequisite for creating a decarbonized and increasingly resilient energy system. On the other side, democracies are maybe also in a stronger position for adapting to what's coming, because they have a much stronger connection to the communities on the ground, to the civil society, that can act as kind of a warning beacon basically to the governments and transfer the worries that are on the ground that have not yet arrived at the governmental thinking much quicker than it happens in authoritarian countries. But this is not a very straightforward relation. I think the democracies are going to be challenged, but they also have instruments to address what's coming to them.
Thanks. Do we have a question from the floor from anyone? Gentleman over here in the corner.
I've got a question. Jim Harvey, I have everybody. Can you wait for the mic?
Yeah.
Oh, you want better. Okay, that sounds all right. Not too close. Jim Harvey's my name, defence member. Question is, and this is from a point of rampant ignorance, the impacts of climate change on two important like geopolitical strongholds. The first, the Himalayas. Second, the Arctic. The Himalayas is both a watershed to the two most populous countries in the world, China and India, and the depleting ice in the Arctic, how that impacts both access and resource accessibility in the north, how that might impact the balance between India, China, Russia, and the balance across the Pacific between the US and those countries.
John, Maria, David?
I'll default to Maria to start with, I think.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'd maybe address Arctic first. And we see on the one side, this region is one of the most vulnerable globally to the climate change. The global warming happens just much quicker in Arctic than happens in other places. On the other side, as you said, it opens new opportunities for countries that have territory bordering with Arctic region or part of the territory of which lies in the Arctic region, opening new trade routes. That's what Russia is very much hoping for, but also opening new parts of Arctic where particularly fossil fuel production, fossil fuel extraction and production can be boosted. That is also what the Russian energy industry is currently very much hoping for. But it is by no means certain that this will automatically lead to an increased Russian influence just because it can pump more oil and gas from the Arctic. Because the big question is actually will the global demand for oil and gas be there by the time the extraction of these resources is actually possible? And this is really up to the major buyers of oil and gas, be it China, be it the US, be it the European Union, to really predetermine the future global demand for fossil fuels, and hence also predetermine the future leverage of Russia, for example. Also geopolitical leverage, as we have seen on the events of this week, via its role as a major energy supplier. So what maybe last point, what we see, the Arctic really shows the role that the fossil fuel suppliers are having right now as a geopolitical powers, and it also shows the role that these fossil fuel suppliers might not have in the future if the world really manages to go forward with the energy transition and to go away from the dependency on fossil fuel imports. I'm particularly talking about major consumers of fossil fuels, be it China, be it the European Union or the US. So this is maybe my main takeaway from, but it's a very, very important question.
Thanks, Maria. David?
If I could pick up on the Himalayan element of the question. The Himalayan region is a great example of these issues of interconnection and complexity that we've been talking about. The great river systems of the Himalaya, the Ganges, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, even the Mekong has its headwaters in the Himalaya, are all transboundary basins shared by many countries, and often the downstream countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, depend significantly on water resources that in fact originate outside of their borders, so that management decisions made by upstream countries have significant ramifications for the downstream countries. Himalaya also exemplifies the diversity of the water resources availability, that in the Indus, for example, a very high proportion, particularly depending on the season, a very high proportion of the Indus waters depend on snow melt and ice melt from the glaciers, up to 40-50% or more, depending on the estimates. Whereas in a river system like the Mekong, which is a monsoon river system, much more of the water in the river system comes from rainfall throughout the basin. So there's somewhat less dependence on snow and ice melt from high up in the basin. And so all these dynamics have significant impacts on the policy implications for the different countries. But a main factor, a very important factor, is the geopolitical tensions, the mistrust that exist between these countries that the questioner mentioned. That the relations to underlie cooperative and collaborative policies between India and Pakistan or India and China are not the same as those between the United States and Canada, for example, or Switzerland and France. So on the one hand, the benefits to collaborative policies in shared river basins are extremely high in Himalaya. But at the same time, underlying political factors, the territorial tensions, the political tensions, et cetera, make those collaborative policies as much more necessary, but also challenging. All that being said, the countries in question, they do recognize these challenges. And so it is part of their own governance challenge to overcome the mistrust and the misperceptions and seize upon the cooperative opportunities. This would be very valuable. It's easier said than done.
Thanks, David. John, do you have?
Look, I'd just only add about the Mekong and Vietnam as an early indicator of this, and I think that the Chinese Communist Party government's damming at multiple points along the Mekong River clearly show that quite often self-interest rules over common interest. And certainly at the moment anyway, despite it being a monsoonal river, there are grave concerns within the Mekong Delta as the sort of breadbasket or food basket of Vietnam about production and what that will look like. And what it will look like in terms of fishing, in terms of those dams. And to date, whilst there's been lots of talk, the reality is that's already playing out for the Vietnamese. And I think if I go by your question, does it give you additional geopolitical influence? Well, I think it does. And I think it's very clear which countries are willing to use that influence when it's in their interest.
We have time for one very, very quick question. Sorry, and please wait for the microphone so that everybody can hear you. Thank you.
So my name is Michel from the Cyprus High Commission. I would like to ask all the panelists how realistic you find your scenario, the 1.5 at least. Because if I'm reading correctly, this is the minimum expected, the 1.5. So how realistic you find it that it will not be 2, for example, 2 centigrades the increase? And second, and very fast, with the decarbonization pace of humanity, do you believe that something good can happen in the next 30 years in relation with the increase of the temperature? Many thanks.
Thank you. And just in the interest of time, can I just get one of the panel members to answer those questions, and then we'll have to wrap up. And I will nominate Maria.
Thanks. On the viability of 1.5, as we have seen during the commitments that have mushroomed all over the place during COP26, we definitely see that the world is getting ready for achieving this goal, and it is still within reach, although the window of achieving it is rapidly closing, because not least because the climate impacts are accelerating and making it much more difficult for countries to implement their policies. The IEA Net Zero Roadmap, which it produced last year and shows how the world can achieve 1.5, really shows that international cooperation is key to achieving this number. They showed that without international cooperation across all the policies, across all economy systems, the 1.5 the 1.5 degree scenario can only achieve by 2090, which is way too late. And this scenario doesn't count in climate impact. So this is an ideal scenario. International cooperation is definitely key. And on the question of whether something good will happen from decarbonization, well, we already see this happening. And in terms of human health, of course, improved living conditions, as in cleaner air, cleaner cooking, particularly in the emerging markets and developing economies. We see new value chains being created, new spots of industrial growth, also in the global south, which are definitely positive moments, but it's by far not enough of these positive moments. And as we see that the finance flows are still mostly in the global south, in OECD countries and China, and this needs to happen very rapidly. It needs to change very rapidly if we want these good things that you mentioned be available also for a majority of the countries in the Pacific.
Thanks, Maria. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but I just wanted to thank everyone online for submitting their questions. We had a whole bunch of online questions. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to them, but I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight to launch this work. And please join me in thanking our panelists and guests tonight. And as one final point, just to remind everybody that you can get a soft copy of the book on the ASPI website, so I encourage you to go and have a look for it there. Thank you.